you so much for attending the final event of Speak On. We need to talk about mental health. Today, the topic is, are you man enough? The crisis of masculinity, which is why I'm not going to take part. I'm going to hand it over to these guys that you can see here. I'm going to hand over to Danny and then I'll be back on at the end. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you everyone for your continued support as well of the events. And thank you so much everyone that's taken part. There will be time for questions as well. So please make use of the Q&A button that you can see. And anything that is mentioned as well, I'll be online, but in the background I will share in the chat to make sure that everybody can have access to links and all that kind of fun stuff. But I'll hand over to Danny now, and then I will locate Nathaniel, who's the other panelist, and get him in. Okay.
All right. Hi guys, I'm Danny Price, and I'll be hosting today's Speak On. What's it called again? This is my first time doing this. I'll be hosting today's talk, and yeah, I hope you all enjoy. So if I'd just like to hand over to panelists to introduce themselves, that'd be great. So Ash, you go first.
Thanks, cheers Danny. Hi everyone. My name's Ash Bhardwaj. I currently work mostly as a travel journalist. I write for the Telegraph Travel as a columnist, and I write freelance for a bunch of others and do a podcast called The First Mile, as well as doing freelance writing, bit of presenting and video production as well. I'm also an officer in the British Army Reserve. I'm in an infantry unit called 7 Rifles. So that takes up somewhere between 27 and 100 days a year, depending on what I'm doing. So those are the two things I spend most of my time doing. I've actually been in counselling and therapy for about 10 years. And so I am a great advocate of the value of discussing the underlying causes of male angst or general mental ill health and finding good ways of dealing with it.
Great. And Alexis, you next.
Hi there, my name is Alexis Caught. I always find it a bit awkward talking about myself because we're taught don't show off, don't go and do all this stuff, but it's that cringe bit which you've got to do. So I have written some things. I also make a podcast focusing on the LGBTQ community, which is my home, that is my people. And I talk quite a lot about queer men's mental health as well, because as with all communities, the society that you are raised up in, your people, you will have specific needs according to that. I'm also an ambassador and a crisis counsellor for the Royal Foundation's mental health charity, which is called Shout. That is Shout 85258. We are a text crisis service similar to Samaritans, but we're all over text and digital. That was founded by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge about 18 months ago, and I've been on board since the start, and I'm currently approaching my master's in psychotherapy as well.
Great. And just in time we have Nathaniel. Hi Nathaniel. You need to, yeah, can you, yeah?
That famous line of, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, you're just in time. So if you want to just introduce yourself and just tell everyone about yourself, that'd be great, thanks.
Certainly. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and apologies for my bit of delay. I had the wrong link mixed up. My name's Nathaniel Pamah. I'm from the UK, born in London, and I've worked in, I guess, I'm a brother of 6 siblings. I always like to start from family. Brother of 6 siblings, 2 sisters and 3 brothers, so altogether we're 6. I've worked in mental health for over 12 years now. Started when I was 21, background in social science and mental health and recovery. I am a mental health and recovery facilitator and trainer, and I've just recently developing a wellbeing hub for those in the BAME community. So that's me in a nutshell, and thank you for having me.
Great stuff. So I guess we'll get straight into it. So our first question is, what does masculinity mean, and is masculinity in a crisis? And we're going to direct that to Ash first.
Thanks. Well, I guess masculinity varies across different groups for a whole host of things. You know, your ethnicity, your cultural background, your family background, your economic situation, kind of education you have. And masculinity seems to be perceived as ways of behaviours, values, and attitudes that group decides this makes you masculine. And I guess that is becoming a lot more fluid now, because you would have said a few years ago that it's defined purely by an XY chromosome pairing. But I guess there's a lot more fluidity about the interpretation of that. So I think it's a good time to be thinking about what masculinity means. I guess the question about whether or not masculinity is in crisis might come down to the fact that a lot of things which used to be jobs done purely by people with that XY chromosome either don't exist, or they're becoming a lot more open. So I'm in the Army Reserve Infantry, and in the last couple of years, the infantry had dismounted close combat, as it's known, so the kind of stuff you see in Saving Private Ryan, has been opened up to women. So a lot of jobs that used to be purely for men are now open to everybody. And maybe the crisis comes from men losing their exclusivity in certain areas. And I think there are certain things that only women are able to do, or only people with a womb are able to do, such as give birth. There's not many things that men still do that women can't do. So perhaps a lot of the crisis of masculinity comes from that. There's nothing that makes us special anymore. I think that's probably all I have to say about that.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I see you nodding there, Nathaniel. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, it's a lot what I agree with there from Ash, and I think there's so many facets to what we regard as masculine. So I think what I come from also the dynamic of what we traditionally regard masculinity as. You know, it's been debated and argued that masculinity is a social construct. And so where do we get that idea from of what it means to be a man? And so that's where I think it segues into that. Is there a crisis because we're unsure about what masculinity is? And like what Ash emphasized, are women taking up the roles which are traditionally seen as what men roles are? But yeah, it's an interesting kind of totally covered debate here. So yeah, my nod in there.
Our next question is, it's for you, Alexis. Would you consider yourself to be man enough? It's a very broad question. I know, but like, yeah, what do you think?
I think that's an absolute trap of a thing to even ask ourselves, because it's like, well, enough for what? For me? For society? For culture? For my parents? For a partner? For what? That's the big thing. For me, absolutely. I like that personally. I quite enjoyably flit around the gender expression like spectrum, and that I quite happily play rugby and have done for years, and I really enjoy it. And that's a masculine space. But I absolutely also love dancing and musicals, which is, quote, a less masculine space. And I don't have any problem with those two things coexisting within my own interpretation of masculinity. Does that mean that I'm not masculine enough for other people? Absolutely. I've been on the end of horrendous like femphobia and gay shaming as well, because society has historically for a very, very long time told queer men, no, you're not man enough because of X, Y, and Z, because you're not an alpha, like straight man's man. And so for me, it's, yeah, I'm man enough for me, but it's because I don't actually care. That's why.
Do you think that the actual term man enough, the term, I actually can't stand it, to be honest. But do you think that should be slowly or as soon as possible, like sort of eradicated from language that we use?
Oh, just in the bin. Just absolutely bin it. What? Yeah. But like I said at first, man enough for what?
Yes.
And when you actually get that going and go, well, man enough for what? To do what? To be what? To be where? People can't answer it logically. You always have to get people to explain their own bias to out loud, and then they slowly unpick it for themselves.
Yeah. Ash, with your background, what do you think about that?
Phrase.
Yeah.
I'll say, yeah, because Well, I guess it comes down to internal and external validation. And if you look at people that are behaving what's often termed as toxic masculinity, which I guess really is just people lashing out in laddish, boorish, in misogynistic ways, you know, that often seems to be a reaction to them not having met some kind of external validation or external criteria of being masculine. You know, I spent time in various different sort of masculine groups, whether that's playing rugby at university or afterwards, or indeed in the army, going through both Sandhurst and Brecon. And I've seen really good and really bad examples of what it means to be masculine enough. The worst examples are probably just, I guess, what would be quite what you would definitely call misogynistic behaviour towards women through some of my peers who I played rugby with at university. But then I look at other things that are really starting to shift that. And the military is a good example of this right now. Earlier on in the year, we were doing preparation for the stuff around COVID. And one of the first briefs we got was an excellent mental health brief, and the ability, talking about how you should speak to people about your feelings and accept that you will have a range of stress reactions. That just didn't exist in army discussions a few years ago. And I think it was triggered by the tragedies of what happened with people who came back from some of the recent conflicts and the way that affected their mental health. And just also, of course, if you think about the demographic that the army tends to recruit from, young men as a majority who have a higher proportion of suicide for young men. So the army's really started to recognise this problem and face up to it quite directly, which I think has been a really good thing that they've been doing. And how is that affecting the notion of masculinity within the army? Well, it suggests that now talking about your feelings and expressing them it has shifted from something that was not masculine to that's a part of masculinity. So it returns back to the fluidity element of what both Alexis and Nathaniel were talking about.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's very much the throughout, well, our lives anyway, like a lot of sort of, well, my uncles or father or whatever would be like, you know, it's the kind of mix up between masculinity and actual strength, you know, and I think that's always sort of been blurred and sort of delivered as strength is manly and is masculine, and it's not really the case, is it?
Well, what type of strength? Because there are so many different types of strength.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, like, obviously, like for guys being told, like, you know, strength, it's the physical strength, isn't it? Whereas, you know, I'm like not afraid to say it all, like in terms of mental strength, I think that women are a lot like better coping with that as opposed to men, because we're sort of told, you know, you need to be a man and you need to be strong, but you know, that's only showed in physical strength, but you know, they don't actually attach the mental strength to it. Do you know what I mean?
I can only speak for that one organisation that I'm a part of, and I like seeing how that has changed literally in the last 2 to 3 years. And I think you do need institutions in leadership positions to drive that kind of change, whether that's school, government, or in that case, the military, saying, look, this is what you're doing. I mean, the difference with the military, of course, is you say, this is what you're doing because it's your job. You have to sit around and talk about this, which is quite an enforced method, but then it eventually becomes a new form of behaviour.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to see that you can just change that over the course of a few years by instituting enforced behaviours.
That's great. Nathaniel, this next question's for you, and it's, how does the concept of masculinity affect you in your job in your life?
I mean, it's changed over time. So I can imagine I started out working. If I think of my working environments, and go on to family, but working environments, from starting working in mental health from 21 was very much my first role was as an administrator, as a receptionist, and so that is traditionally known to be a role of which females would take up and still do to this day. But I at no way, I guess, through my journeys starting there, felt kind of inhibited, and I think that was boiled down to how much one has a sense of self, you know, how you define yourself uniquely. And it's kind of touching what Alexis had touched on with regards to how do you define strength? Things are subjective, so my time starting out, naturally, I wanted to rear into the roles that were traditionally known for men, being a doctor, a probation officer, a social worker. But I still didn't have that sense of almost like desperation or insecurity, but with family, I guess that's where kind of what Ash was touching on. There is less institution, there's less, for my family anyway, not that it was dysfunctional, but the fact that we had the ability to kind of, I've grown up with sisters. As I said, I had a big sibling family. I would do some of the roles which traditionally would be from, what we've known as feminine roles. But because mum and dad really installed in me, you need to know everything. It kind of just, as the years gone by, it didn't become so much of an issue. But I know the mass of us, because of the society we live in, the institutions and how they're arranged, it's shifting, but that's, it's not the norm so much. But yeah, I can say my journey has been quite one where the insecurity of being a man is similar, touching on what Alexis said as well. I don't really care so much. I kind of just want to show that I am Nathaniel. So yeah, it's about subjectivity, I think.
On the subject of that, I'm going to take that to Ash and Alexis. Like, did you have, like your families, did you have siblings, brothers or sisters? And how did, the sort of the masculinity like impact you, if like, from your different perspectives?
Shall I go first, Alexis?
Yeah, you first.
I was raised mostly by my mum. My dad was sort of like non-present pretty much from the age of 11. He was an alcoholic, and partly through his own traumas of youth in his own relationship with his own father. So I was raised primarily by my mum, and my sister was and both of them still are very significant parts of my life. So I spend a lot of time speaking to them and on the phone with them. So I think I never had that strong male role model, but I certainly learned a lot about empathy and listening and consideration because of the way my mother and my sister were both with each other. But I think that's certainly improved in me in the last few years, having strong women around me in my life, and always turning to them for guidance and friendship and advice as much as anyone else. How does that affect my masculinity now? Well, maybe it just means that I have a greater, just having had that growing up with more sensitivity. That's probably about it, really. And I think, basically some sort of what Alexis and Nathaniel both have said, not having to feel like I need to prove any element of masculinity or define myself by that, which is always interesting in a very sort of alpha environment, which is what the infantry is.
Alexis?
So I'm going slightly off the question that you asked, but just responding to what
Cool. Go
Ash
ahead.
said, in that I come to it from a different point of view, in that growing up, it wasn't so much my parents who signalled gender or performative masculinity to me. It was actually society. So I grew up in the 90s and the early noughties, when we still had virulent cultural homophobia. It wasn't until 2004 and then later in 2010 when actually we had equal representation in schools around sexuality. Until 2004, schools were banned from teaching about homosexuality. And so culturally, I was very much told from a young age, no, you're not a man. You can't be a man. And so that is actually where I got my biggest messages about what it meant to be a man. Because if we also look at what the media we were consuming, back then it was lots of kind of like very, very macho, machismo heavy, quite toxic portrayals and old-fashioned portrayals of masculinity, which was entirely responsible for conditioning generations of men as to what we should be, rather than questioning who we really are. So I'm quite fortunate in that I actually have two dads. They're not in a gay relationship. I just have a biological father and I have an adoptive dad, and I've got a really good relationship with both of them. One of them is a very outdoorsy man's man. From him, I got climbing and rugby. From my other dad, I got a love of musicals and arts. And they sit both very comfortably in their heterosexuality, but at very different ends of the spectrum there. And myself, I bounce in between them because that's how I was conditioned and raised by them. Also raised by a very feminist mother who, when I was 6 and they asked what I wanted for Christmas, I said I wanted a Snow White dress. Lots of parents at that time would have been like, nope. Mine took me to the Disney store to find one that fit me. And because they were very, very much raised with this belief of you shouldn't actually assume a child's gender or sexuality. And I'm sure we're going to come to that later, so I won't go into it now. But how do we even know our gender? How do we even know that we are men? And we should also create a distinction between being a man and male, because we've also used the term female interjectively with woman, and they're not the same thing. So we should cover that later as well.
Correct. Okay, cool. Can we talk about toxic and fragile masculinity, and what are your opinions on them, and what are they? And I'll take that to Ash first.
It's probably not, I mean, I don't know if I'm really qualified to comment on these things. I think I briefly touched on it. What I think of as toxic masculinity is men looking for external validation and performing actions which are usually damaging to other people in order to compensate for own lack of internal validation about their identity. That would be my, I'm certainly not like these two guys. I've not worked either in mental health or have an understanding of identity from those sorts of perspectives. That's how I would interpret it. When I've encountered people behaving in that way, what one would call toxic actions, it's usually because they're trying to prove an element of their masculinity. That's been my experience of it from others, and indeed probably for myself. Alexis was just talking about the way sexuality was used as an insult back in the early noughties, and I can certainly think back on ways that I would just insult somebody in my class, whether or not they were in fact gay, but using gay as an insult, just as something that was done. So those are toxic masculine actions can change over time through education, but they're also a product, I think, of your internal angst.
Definitely. I'm also on the same page as you, Ash. Like in school, it was like a thing that kids just used to do, and I am also very guilty of doing that when I was a kid as well. Ash, what are your views on the toxic masculinity and fragile masculinity?
Well, Alexis,
sorry. Sorry, man.
That's quite all right. I'd echo everything that Ash said, absolutely. But also from just on a comment as well that Ash said, in that he didn't come from like a background to this topic from a mental health perspective, like Nathaniel or I don't actually really think that is particularly relevant here, because we all experience masculinity in ourselves, and we all have male friends, and we all occupy different spaces, and there is no one thing that is masculinity. There is no one thing which is being a man. There is no one thing which is being male. And so everybody's lived experience, I think, is valuable, because then we start to diversify what it means to be male. We start to diversify what it means to be a man, and we start to diversify what masculinity is. So the more people we can have speaking on it from all different backgrounds is way better, because for too long, what masculinity is and what being a man is has been dictated by upper class, white, heterosexual, privileged man. And that's not the world. That's a tiny percent of the world. And the rest of us need to get in and actually say what being a man is to us as well. And we also need to ask women what is being a man. We need to ask non-binary people and trans people what is it as well. But to go back to toxic masculinity, 100%, it is a whole host of corrosive behaviors which are damaging to the self and damaging to those around us. It is toxic masculinity, which, as Ash absolutely rightly called out, drives people to act out in really bad ways. The patriarchy did an amazing job of rebranding aggression and anger as not being an emotion, as just being an expression of manliness. Whereas if a woman cries, oh, they're too emotional. If a man hits a wall, or if a man shouts and swears or punches someone, that's not him being emotional. That's just him being a man. That's toxic masculinity.
Absolutely. Nathaniel, can I get your views on this?
Yes, I think Alexis just touched on a point which I kind of want to expand on with regards to, you know, when you dive deeper into the diversity of what it means to, you know, when you was mentioned there, Alexis, you know, the interchangeability of women and female, I had to check myself and think, yes, I was saying that. But it's the fact that these are behaviors, right? These are characteristics. And so any individual, male or female, or however you class your sexuality, can portray these traits. I think it, you know, expressed from Ash and Alexis as well, is how damaging is that? You know, and I'll just touch on some of the examples. I've done a bit of research and thought it makes you kind of self-assess as well. For me, self-assess. So being stoic, you know, the idea of wanting to be self-reliant, independent, tough, physical, you know, also being promiscuous, or being violent, you know, as was touching on, being dominant. And then I came to think, well, it kind of leans on the question you asked before. Well, what the whole theme is about is there a crisis of masculinity? Because some of these traits, it's just the pure sense of the keyword of toxic, you know, and masculinity being played out by different people. It's harmful not only to the society and individuals, but to oneself as well. You know, I always bring to the case of balance and order. And, you know, we can't really define that because I'm happy about it, but we're all unique. So that balance and order is different for everybody, you know. But yeah, they came across some information. It's like the top 10 toxic masculine ways of being. Not always associated with men, but obviously on the mass it is. So yeah.
I'm going to go back to Alexis. Like, in terms of the terminology, toxic masculinity, what do you feel about the term?
That we can get into very obvious discussions around it, and that toxic masculinity is people shouting, it is people violent, is people being sexually violent as well. But it's also us speaking to little boys and be like, you're a big boy, don't cry. That's toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity is the fact that men are far more likely to die from cancer because they don't want to go to the doctor and cause a fuss. It is the fact that men only make up 1/3 of mental health recommendations to get help from the NHS, and yet 75% of suicides. That's all toxic masculinity. Like, toxic masculinity is the fact that if you look at celebrities, we have lots of, not enough, but we have a lot of out gay celebrities, and we have a huge galaxy full of out heterosexual celebrities who've never actually had to come out as heterosexual. But where are the bisexual men? Where are they?
Good point,
Because toxic masculinity actually really represses people's expression of themselves. Because it's like, nope. You can't step foot into that fluid pool or into the other pool. So toxic masculinity is all of those things.
I'm gonna stick with you about this. I've been like, why? Obviously, we're talking about toxic masculinity is like the reason why guys won't go to the doctors about, you know, certain things. And but like there's more to it, you know, in terms of like, can we just like sort of elaborate on why men don't open up about their problems?
Well, from a young age, as I mentioned, we're taught big boys don't cry, which is, of course, a nonsense. People should cry. Crying is actually a very valid and healthy reaction to a lot of things. It's very cathartic. Why don't men go to the hospital? Well, a lot of it is triggered into ego a lot of the time. To be a man is a very ego-laden term, and both Ash and Nathaniel have touched on this earlier, in that a lot of these negative outbursts that we see are when people's egos and their id and their superego is just got and burst, because unfortunately society has taken away from men in many, many ways. In a really obvious one, going back to what Ash was saying, all of these traditionally men-only workplaces are rightly now being gender inclusive, because feminism has come in and done brilliant, brilliant things and said, actually, you know what, little girls, you can be anything, you can do anything. But we've not had a comparable thing for little boys to say, you know what, you can be anything. You don't just have to be a fireman. You don't just have to be a policeman. You don't just have to be a soldier. You can be a teacher. You can be a baker. You could be a dancer. You could be a stay-at-home dad. And none of those affect how we will see you. None of those things affect how society will appraise you. Because when we talk about gender neutral, strangely enough, the conversation at a societal level is nearly always about women going to male-dominated spaces, and very rarely about men doing the other thing and going into women-dominated spaces. It's very rarely is it that actually there's a conversation to teenage boys at GCSE being like, well, you know what, you don't have to go into STEM. You could go and do a BTEC in beauty. You could go and do a holistic therapy treatment if you wanted to. Whereas we're having loads, and rightly, conversations getting young women to go into STEM as an example, but we're not going both ways, which I personally think is actually still just saying masculinity is the best, femininity and womanhood is lesser, because we're somehow implying that one is better than the other, rather than going, everyone should do everything. I've gone on a bit of a rant there. I don't think I've answered your question, but I've also gone off somewhere else. So I'll just hand back to you now. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm going to go to Nathaniel on this. Like, how can we open up the dialogue around mental health?
I think, well, from my experience, the process has been, so I've worked in mental health across a few teams, early intervention to CAMS, to drugs and alcohol, to community mental health teams. And I think always the approach of psychological therapies, the fact of being able to talk, as we're doing now, even this being a helpful exercise. But there are stages, so it depends on someone's situation and their own mental status, shall we say. So we use an approach called the cycle of change, and sometimes people are kind of in a situation where they're not even acknowledging that there's something that they need to address, be it in this case, you know, identity, masculinity. And so there's normally an approach of a one-to-one, you know, having that space to just speak to someone on a one-to-one. And then once you can be more expressive, or being able to actually acquire the tools to express how you feel, you know, even down to the describing words. And I've struggled with that personally, of being able to say, well, is happy and I'm sad the only things that I know? So I think there's being able to equip someone with the tools to educate them, to allow them to explore different ways they can express themselves, whether that's through art therapy. There may need to be an indication or a referral or an acknowledgement that medication may need to come into play. But it's normally, for me, the therapeutic approach, starting on a one-to-one and then opening up into a group. And always, I think family therapy is a good dynamic. The first, what we've all touched on, the first 0 to 5 years of your life is your developing years, your attachment years. And that's what's crucial as well. So yeah, I think there's stages to it. It doesn't work for everybody. And the last thing I would mention is that that approach of why we don't go into the health services as much. I think there's as much as how we feel, and society, the institution, and how it's systematically arranged, is not kind of opening, I think, to all people, sexuality, religion, race, still, but it's getting better. But it's that which I think also plays a part in stopping us, from really engaging. So yeah.
That's great. That's a great answer. I'm going to take this over to Ash, and like on that subject, is there any sort of experience that you've had, or any experience that you wish you had to sort of help you recognize at an earlier stage or a more relevant stage the issues surrounding mental health with your job or in school or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think with any kind of ill health, whether that is body ill health or mental ill health, you often are unaware of the first stages of an illness, and it's only when you get some quite clear symptoms that you start to notice anything going wrong. If you've got bad posture, then suddenly you're unable to use your shoulder one day. If you'd have known halfway along that you had a problem with your tendon, you could have stopped yourself destroying your shoulder. We're just not attuned to having that sensitivity about our emotions and our mental health. And I think, Nathaniel talks about the describing words, and I'd never thought about it like that before. But if we discuss those sort of things at earlier ages at school and primary school, then we'd be better able to express anxiety or depression or everything else that's on the spectrum in between happiness and depression. And for me, I didn't know what was going. I'd effectively had a panic attack, and I didn't identify it as a panic attack. I wasn't able to self-identify that, and I'd gone into A&E, and it was only because I was with my mum, and I was 26 at the time. She's the one that took me in, and one of the doctors or nurses asked, "Are you depressed?" It was my mum that answered on my behalf. I was just unaware of that. I was unaware that I was having an expression of mental health with a panic attack, and I was unaware of my background emotion being that low, my background mood being that low. So that's where discussion and being able to use examples, and for everyone being able to access examples of what those things are, is important. Now, some of that can be art and culture, that can be television series, and I think one of the great things about TV over the last 5 or 6 years is there's been much better expression of mental health and much better honesty about the things that people go through. Guilt is quite an important aspect of this. I think if you have mental ill health or you have a mental health crisis, then it's like, shit, there's something wrong with me, without understanding that often those things are a product of trauma. For me, it was having an alcoholic father. And then knowing that going through counselling and therapy can be a really powerful way of coping with those things. Even though you don't ever have a full resolution necessarily, understanding that these things can be made better. I think simply knowing that those things exist and things are okay is half of the path. And I think arts and culture is a really powerful way to do that. And then specific education is another one. And I've mentioned how they do it in the army, but I think it's quite hard for people in other institutions or once you've left education to be able to gain that knowledge.
That's right. It's something that I feel quite strongly about. Like similar to you, Ash, I suffered from mental health issues for basically all my life and didn't even realise it. It was only like a couple of years ago when I was finally able to sort of do something about it. And I've always thought that there should be some sort of exercise in like secondary school or maybe even primary school to sort of reach out to kids that may not know that they are sort of building up some kind of mental issues. What do you guys think about that? I'll go to Alexis first.
I completely agree. There should be. There used to be, and then the Conservatives cut it all away. Quite simply enough. So if you want to sum up why we're having such a bad mental health crisis in schools and in young men, in one word, it's Tories. In a longer answer, it's because we have had I personally believe, back in the 70s, in the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan years, where there was this whole belief of there is no such thing as society, and it's all about the individual, and individualism reigned. I personally believe we're still experiencing the after effects of that because we aren't funding things properly. We don't have that social support structure. In existential psychotherapy, which is the school of therapy that I believe in most and practice, one of the key fundamentals that it argues we need is society and social connectiveness. School is a really, really important place where we can get that. But unfortunately, it's being eroded because they're being turned into young people having to just perform for tests rather than thinking of people as holistic human beings. And realistically, you can't perform in a test if you're not performing like fully in your own brain, because mental health is coming in. Like, teenage years are difficult for nearly everybody. Your hormones are just playing horrendous tricks on you at that time of your age, let alone all the other things that society will throw at young people. And so we really, really do need support for young people. And as like Nathaniel and Asha rightly said, that begins with education as well, and just starting to talk to people from a young age and model that as well.
That's great. And Nathaniel, can I get your views on that, and maybe like any ideas of what we sort of can do and what advice you'd give to any sort of, you know, people in education or tutors or stuff like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I was going to touch on is kind of leading from what Alexis had mentioned. With regards to education, there's one facet which doesn't even need to be in the setting of a school. And it's ironic that, again, mention of the Tories, but our lovely Kemi Bernadotte, I believe her name is, mentioned quite rigorously in that kind of the debate they had with regard, or celebration of Black History Month. She mentioned, you know, we cannot afford to have critical theory within schools. The critical theory, and it's that very essence of being able to be critical of oneself, of society, as an individual, is what can open up the mind and bring about more of, you know, in a safeguarding way, a healthier development of one's mental state, you know, because they're able to question things freely, or more freely, to be able to explore. So that's one aspect. But then going back into schools, and, you know, for children, for play clubs, after school clubs, summer clubs, Saturday schools, the idea of what we traditionally know as female roles and male roles need to be, and I like the word Alexis used, fluid. It needs to be where, when I was at school, we had home economics. You know, that was essentially learning how to cook. We know traditionally thinking that that's a female, you know, role, although it's changed, very much changing now. And so the changing of roles allowed young people to have to, almost in an institutional way, have to engage in things, to ask questions. And that's where I think that element of critical thinking can also come in. So I think those are two suggestions that I would give. And also to just discuss that healthy, I always think within the home, you know, it's very key. And I kind of take on board, similar to Alexis, I had my father and my stepfather. My father passed away. I had my own mental health challenges and, you know, was depressed for periods, and that fluctuates. But family, you know, and that doesn't need to be biological, but family and the ability to talk, I think, is what's helpful through those younger years and growing up into that. So yeah, that's the advice I would give.
What advice?
If I could just add a quick addendum, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Just to anyone who is in the audience wondering, kind of like, well, why are they raising politics around this? And it's because mental health is the self, and the self is political. We're talking about, you need to get support through the NHS. Well, the NHS is funded by political parties. It is political parties that decide what funding they get. We're saying, what can we do for children in schools? It's political parties which decide what goes into school funding, what goes into the curriculum. It's political parties that decide how much CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services, gets funded. So the self and mental health is inherently political. So you have to discuss both in tandem. It's difficult and it's uncomfortable because then you get into that whole we shouldn't talk about politics thing, but they are interlinked.
Of course, of course. To all of you, really, we'll start with you, Nathaniel. What advice would you give for men that are struggling to open up but need to?
I'm going to take my own personal example, which I've kind of flirted about, and it's very simple, but I've needed to set an alarm clock. Writing in a journal, writing in a diary, just from what you can do right now with no cost by yourself individually, a starting point. I'd always say writing or even voice recording, to then read it back, to then listen over to what you've said, because you need to have the conversation with yourself first and try and figure out what are the problems or what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of yourself, you know, an exploration of self. So I would always advocate a diary, and there in itself is also something that has been traditionally known as a female thing to do. But if you want to break that mold, you know, and help oneself, and as I said, I need to set an alarm clock because it's so not in my routine or about me. I'm like, oh, diary, what do I need to do that for? But it's been very helpful, and I would advocate that to any person, anyone, you know.
And I'll take that same question to Ash.
Thanks. That's a really good point, Nathaniel. I keep mine here for exactly that reason. Similarly, I found meditation to be quite a useful thing, just because it gives you time to just sort of self-reflect and see what thoughts and emotions are coming up, and then that sort of puts you more in tune with your own, makes you more sensitive to your own feelings in a way that often you're distracted by the pace of life or Instagram or everything else, and it's a way to just have that time to focus on yourself. Another one is, we hear the phrase, it's good to talk a lot. And I think something that's important is to acknowledge that maybe the first person you speak to may not be the right one to speak to for you. And when I think about my friends, each of them have very different roles in my life, and each of them I speak to about for very different things. And actually, the ones that have turned out to be the ones that are best for me to speak to about my own anxieties, my own fears, tend to not have been the ones I would have expected to have been the best ones to speak to. And so if when you're speaking to people about things, the first person doesn't respond particularly well or in a way that reassures you, it's easy to then be put off. So I think what I'm trying to say is, if the first person you speak to doesn't turn out to be the right one, maybe just try and speak to some other people until you finally get a response that works, or an experience that works better for you.
And then same question to you, Alexis.
From a very tangible and immediate point of view, and building on what Ash said about reaching out and speaking to people, as a ambassador and a crisis line counsellor for Shout 85258, that's Shout 85258, everybody, just straight up and down your keyboard on your phone. You can text Shout to that number, and there is immediate free confidential crisis intervention and counselling. We actually get a lot of men reaching out on the line, because a lot of men struggle quite often to have those first conversations and verbalize what they're feeling inside. Because as we discussed earlier, we're not equipped from a young age to actually really do that process of self-analysis and explain what is going on inside of us. So if talking or reaching out to a friend or a family member is too daunting, try texting, because actually sometimes it's easier to write it down, and they're absolutely right. Journaling is fantastic. Texting, again, is tapping into that same thing where it's letting your subconscious kind of take over a little bit. And that's the same reason why journaling is so good. That's a very practical tip. I would also, again, coming back to existential psychotherapy, there are a whole bunch of different things which existential psychotherapists and philosophers believe causes mental anguish. Two of the ones which I think affect men the most is isolation and meaninglessness. Isolation, particularly relevant during lockdown and COVID years. A lot of the ways that men actually support one another, football, the pub, the gym, suddenly taken away from us, whereas women have a culture, speaking in very gendered stereotypes here, of being able to ring one another and have a conversation, whereas actually men don't traditionally do that as much, and the places where men go to for support are taken away by lockdown. So find ways of combating that social isolation, reach out. And the other one, meaninglessness. We've had, as we've touched on again earlier, a wave where kind of like the meaning of life is rapidly changing in the 21st century. And a lot of people are arguing, well, if I'm not the breadwinner, if my wife or my girlfriend is earning more than me, am I the man of the house? If I'm actually not the one who is then making all these decisions, am I an alpha male? If I'm not doing this hyper masculine job of being a factory worker, of working in steelworks, of being in a mine, that either my father or my grandfather did when he was my age, am I a man? Am I not able to, if I'm not able to buy a house, am I a failure? This meaninglessness is quite corrosive and quite pervasive. So find a way to connect with the cause bigger than self. So Ash is volunteering with the army. It's a fantastic way and a really great example because it provides a purpose. It gets you out of yourself, connects you with something bigger than yourself, and also provides connection and fights isolation. So one of the reasons why I volunteer is because it connects me with other like-minded people. It gets me out of myself and it gets me involved in other people, and it puts some responsibility onto me, and it puts some routine into my life at times when I really need it, and provides me some structure. So consider if people are getting isolated, and consider if actually you're just feeling a bit disconnected from the world and with a loss of purpose. Find something that is important to you and find a way to connect with it at a community level.
That's great. So now we're going to move into some questions, and I'm going to take this to Alexis because of what you were just saying. With it, just in the terms of isolation, and obviously I don't need to spell it out. We've been in like the second lockdown now, and I've managed to deal with it fantastically, if I'm completely honest. But I'm very aware that a lot of people haven't. So I want to get your views on your experience, what people you guys that you know, their experience, and just talk about it.
So in the rugby club, for example, that I play for, I'm on the committee of the club, and we were sending out a survey of our players to kind of see how safe people felt coming back, whether people wanted to come back, how quickly people wanted to come back, so we could try and estimate numbers so we could start our COVID safe training plan. And I interjected, was like, can we ask guys what mental health state they're in and how COVID has affected them? Because I thought that was really important, because we needed to know how our players were feeling, so we knew actually, are they going to be ready to be thrown straight back in? Are they going to need some warming up emotionally? And 40% of the men in the club that I play for said that lockdown and COVID had a negative impact on their mental health. Sadly, suicides trebled in lockdown, and 75% of suicides are men. So we know that is really, really affecting a lot of people. And unfortunately, I think that is potentially going to get a lot worse in this potential new year, longer winter lockdown. But the ways that people are combating that are staying connected, trying to get keep some meaning in their lives, trying to keep a purpose and a routine, these small things which we can do, which will positively impact.
Right. And Ash, let's talk about your experience during the pandemic and the lockdown, and how have you coped?
Immediate purpose, which was I spent the first 3 or so months working on the defence's response to COVID-19. So I was the unit comms officer for the part of the battalion that was doing mobile testing units. So very much purpose. I had an element of authority and responsibility. So, I was very lucky for that. Also, I was being paid, which not a lot of travel journalists did get paid. Exercise was pretty important for me. I'm finding the second lockdown a lot harder. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, the weather is shit and it's dark early. The other is it's not novel anymore. So right at the beginning, you had some funny memes, you had funny Instagrams. It was an event. Whereas now it's just boring. And yeah, I think those are the two things that I'm finding hardest. How am I coping? With mixed outcomes. My wife she's a doctor at the local hospital, St Thomas's. So right at the beginning, because of the way things happened, she spent a lot more time at home. So I had more company, and we had another friend that was living here during lockdown. So I'm just on my own at home all the time. So that's crap. So the way that I've been doing, the solutions that I've been finding are going out for a bike ride for an hour. So fresh air, some sunshine-ish, well, light. Activity. I sometimes spend 3 hours before I even do any work on a bike ride, but it stops me just sitting at home doing nothing for 3 hours. So another thing I think to relate to that, it's important to acknowledge that everybody is finding it hard, even if externally, like things look good on Instagram, or you've done a lot of good work and you seem to be performing well. It doesn't mean you're not struggling. And I think returning back to the point of how do we cope with mental health well, I think saying to your mates or saying to your peers, or in my case too, if I'm back in a command position to my soldiers, I found lockdown really hard. And then I was like, shit, me too. So I think that honesty and that integrity about struggling, I think is actually half of it, because then someone else says, me too. Not to demean that movement, of course. But someone else says me as well. And yeah. I think that is half of the battle in reassuring yourself that you're not just a weirdo or finding it particularly hard.
And we'll take that to you, Nathaniel, as well. How have you been coping? And any advice for anybody else in the same? We're all in the same situation anyway.
Well, I'm a big believer about positive affirmations and positive mental attitude, which is testing in this period. But I change of my word of coping to managing, in a sense of, almost even at times when it's not literally the case, fact in point, but my first thoughts is wanting to know, have you got a grip of this? Are you managing this? Coping. My first thoughts in my mind is like keeping head above water and just about being able to survive. And at times that is the case, so I would reference that. But I would say it's been managed more. And I've managed okay, but there has been some dark days of having to kind of go through the process, and it's no way unique, but having lost family members directly due to the pandemic, and not being able to be around, when there have been births to family members, and as I've just mentioned, passings from those that have died. But again, still talking about family, what I've found very helpful as a solution has been, and I'm kind of zoomed out, but at the beginning when I had the energy, I would, with my brothers and sisters, every Saturday we would have a quiz night. And it was a simple concept, but we spent more time together, to the point where we knew we'd spent too much time, because the signs were we was annoying each other. And we, by the 6th week, we'd like, right, we've had a good amount of time. But I think that connection again, and what had been difficult, but I think this time has allowed me to be more mindful, has been sleep pattern and eating pattern. And those foundational things can really have an impact on one's mental health anyway. So, and when we're thinking about gender as well, depending on what we're eating, can really increase the chemical impact in our body. So reinforcing to myself, getting that 8 hours sleep. Don't just stay up because you're going to be at home the next day and you know. So, and also trying to grab the opportunity to get to that supermarket when it's quiet and get the right bits of food, which is like a challenge. And that's my kind of equivalent to Ash's going out and getting some exercise, actually. So yeah, that's how I've been managing it. But like what Ash said, and Alexis, it is just the admitting that it has been difficult, you know, and we're in this together. So none of us are kind of, we have our moments, and we should just accept that as we are all human, you know. So it's been manageable, but testing.
Yeah, and as you just said, and it's been repeated a million times, we are all in this together. And it's also, we do need to be very conscious about reaching out to other people, because, you know, some people are having a bad time and some people won't admit that they are having a bad time. So what are some good kind of methods that we can bring that conversation to the table and approach people that, you know, we can see them online and we kind of, because we know them, we know that it's kind of not sincere. So what are some good methods that we can use to approach that with other people? And I'll go to Nathaniel first, actually.
I've done something recent, and I don't know if Mum's tuned in, but loved ones, I guess. I've made good use of, well, I've sent Mum some flowers. You know, I hope you're okay, isn't it? And it was advised to me, actually. But to kind of open up the conversation, or to kind of make a connection, you know, we are approaching that Christmas period. I'd always say, you know, it's showing your expression of wanting to have that conversation, even just before you say, oh, I would like to speak to you, you know. So yeah, I can give that as an example. But I guess I'd also say reaching out to the people that you would otherwise not really have spoken to. So I've had good chats with my aunt, who's based over in Florida in America, and seeing as though we're making use of the Zoom, it's a nice kind of escapism. So if you've got family around the world, or you've not spoken to for some time, I always see that as it can be a bit daunting, but again, we're all in the same situation. So it does allow for that invitation of, how are things over there, all the way around, you know, up in Scotland or over in Australia, you know. Yeah, that's my 2 parts I would advise.
How about you, Ash?
I think offering up some vulnerability, to like some of your own vulnerability, gives that person the space in order to then be a bit more honest. You know, so saying, you know, I'm struggling with the lockdown, how are you doing? Then I think you're more likely to, you know, I saw a couple of questions, how can you really get them to open up? I in my experience, that's been quite a useful one, offering up some of your own vulnerability.
Great stuff. And Alexis?
Ash said it, I could not put it better than that. Like, when we talk about masculinity, we think of men as leaders. Actually lead with your own vulnerability. But being vulnerable takes bravery. Again, we say that is a masculine trait. So be a brave leader and lead with your vulnerability and expose that. And that will be reflected in other people.
And this is actually a question from me. I was thinking about it earlier. Like, what are you guys' opinions on prescription drugs for people who are suffering from mental issues? I'm personally, it's not for me, but I'd like to get your views on those. I'll go to Ash first.
I've never been prescribed prescription drugs, but I've seen close family members for whom it's completely changed their life in very quick periods of time. When they've been going through undergoing other medical treatment, and then having escitalopram, which is an SSRI. You guys will know better than me. SSRI. You can tell me when you guys come on. But seeing like a remarkable change in the person that was taking it. So to the point where that I was extremely worried about that person, their ability to cope with everything else that was going on. And now the benefit for me is I don't have to worry about it, and they're enjoying their life a lot more. So I've seen a really good effect of it. Another very close family member who's on long-term medicine for psychiatric illness, and again, I'll leave you guys to confirm that if I've used the correct term there, that allows him to live a normal life. So as not as someone who's taken it, but having seen the effect of them on other people, I've seen them be very effective for people.
Alexis, what are your opinions on prescription drugs?
It's such a difficult topic.
It is.
I am not pharmacologically trained. I am not medically trained. I come from School of Psychotherapy. Back in the 1960s, there was an experimental psychologist called Robert Lang who argued that actually medication of people with mental illness was actually not about the patient, not about the client, and was all about making society feel better about it. And there are reports that sometimes people who do have borderline personality disorder or depression actually find the total absence of emotion worse. My father, for example, he is a depressive. He has had it for a long part of his life, and for him, he finds being on medication worse because he loses all of the range of emotion. It doesn't just take away the depressive feelings, it takes away all of them. And for him, that's worse. However, on the other hand, you've got people who do genuinely need these things to survive. And I would never just want to dissuade anybody from doing it, because I do actually think that they can be a really, really good way of helping people get through to tomorrow. But I don't think that medication is by itself the only answer. It's not the long-term treatment. It's an alleviation of symptoms in the present. And therapy is a long-term treatment. But unfortunately, because the NHS is severely underfunded, it is sadly cheaper to prescribe some medicine rather than perhaps a year-long course of psychoanalysis, which would have benefits long-term. But sadly, we're not funding that.
Nathaniel, what are your opinions on prescription drugs?
Similar to Alexis and Ash and what he's touched on as well, but I come from the school of psychology mainly, and so that's been my kind of upbringing through it. However, I've grown to understand and respect that there is a place for prescriptive medication for dealing with crisis, is how I see it, and to try and reduce the risk and the harm to themselves or others. But how far that goes thereafter, and that's what Alexis touched on of the long term, is where it needs to be multifaceted. We are holistic beings. We have a physical, mental, spiritual, emotional elements to us, and they affect all areas. So yeah, I'm not so much in support of it on a long term, but I understand to reduce risk. And I had a friend who I had to kind of experience that with, and helping him. He had to be admitted onto an inpatient ward, was suffering from schizophrenia, and my immediate was my emotion. He needs to come off the ward, stop giving his medication. However, it transpired that that's what is needed right there, at that time. And kind of what advice I would only part in giving. Ash was mentioned a few times, of myself and Alexis and maybe our expertise. But what is not considered, I think, hardly at all, is the lived experience, is the fact that we are experts of our own self. And so one needs to have more confidence in self when you are feeling a type of way from the medication. It is about reviewing, it's about reassessing, it's about checking the ingredients, doing your own research if you can. But that's easier said than done when you're going through the crisis. And so it's needing an advocate, someone who's probably outside of the institution, I would say, but has expertise or experience and has got through it. And that's what I would say is key as well. Remembering you are an expert of your own self just by being able to acknowledge your sensations, and to articulate that. That's why we say education is important. So it's power to all of the people, not just the expert, so-called.
That's great. This next question is somebody is they're struggling with their family and they're trying. Their dad's a man's man, so to speak, and they're trying to sort of break him down and make him better at communicating. Is there any advice that any of you could give?
I'd again apologize. I don't know how this impacts or how this manifests. So it's tough to kind of give any tangibles because, as Nathaniel was exactly 100% right on saying, you are the expert in yourself and your own experience, and you have to trust how you feel a lot of the time. I would ask yourself, how is this impacting on you emotionally, spiritually, relationship-wise? And again, lead with authenticity and integrity and some bravery about being vulnerable and actually saying to him, when you do this, this is how it makes me feel. If you continue to do this, this is what I think the long-term outcome for our relationship might be. It's scary and it's tough. And it can feel quite harsh to say, actually, if you keep doing that, I'm not going to want to be around you. I'm not going to necessarily want you around my child. It's tough, but we have to show how we feel when someone makes us feel a certain way, and we have to explain the impact of that sometimes.
That's great. People who are struggling with suicidal thoughts, obviously this like a really huge issue, as Alexis spoke about earlier. What kind of words of advice would you give them to try and take steps to like better themselves in terms of speaking to somebody or opening up? I think I'll go to all of you for that, but I'll start with Ash.
I'd probably rather that Alexis and Nathaniel, who've dealt with these sorts of things more,
That's cool.
Give their thoughts on this. That's
cool. Alexis.
Yeah, unfortunately, I deal with suicides on a almost daily basis. It's shockingly common to have suicidal ideation and to struggle with that. But importantly, you have spoken here about it and taken the first step, which is really brave to do. Can you talk to somebody in your life around that? If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can shout to 85258, and we will be on hand to talk to you about how you're feeling, help you create a safety plan so that you can stay safe. If that doesn't feel right for you, or you feel that your suicidal ideation is getting out of control and you can't control it and you don't feel safe, please call 111 or 999 for immediate emergency response. Those are your best ways of staying safe. And I'd also add that if you are, if you're worried about somebody else, there are two things. One, talk to them, ask them. There's a big fallacy and a myth that talking about suicide encourages suicide, and it's absolutely wrong. If you talk about suicide, people are far less likely to enact suicide. So talk to them and ask them if that's how they're feeling. Show that you care. Make space for them to talk about this thing. And also you can, again, at shout 85258, you can talk to us about a third party person, and we can help support you through that difficult situation. It is a difficult situation, so you shouldn't be alone in it if you're worried about someone else. But reach out, please.
That's great. Have you got anything to add to that, Nathaniel?
No. I think you said it better, and I think the fact that being able to give immediate direct access, I commend you, Alexis, because someone would want something. I've been there myself. That's what I can say, of having that ideation, and you know, you want, if it's right now, you want something right now. So something tangible that Alexis has just given, I think is really helpful. I can't add any more.
That's great. So yeah, I think that concludes the talk, actually. So here's Yolandi.
Hey, hi. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Nathaniel. That was brilliant. It was so great to listen to. It was brilliant to hear your take on everything and just hear you be really vulnerable and really open about your experiences, because I think this is obviously something that is going to help other people. Thank you everyone that joined us today. For everyone that watches this back on YouTube, you can check out the playlist and see all the different videos that we have, and they take you through lots of different subjects as well. And in the captions and comments, and when we send around this video, we'll also send links to all different helplines and anything else that can be of help. Please make sure you're following us on Instagram, instagram.com/speakom with an underscore at the end for more details, because we will be rerunning the mental health series, and we'll be expanding on different topics as well. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again, guys, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Yolanda.
All right. Thanks, guys.